Welcome to Annunciation Radio's Faith with Reasons, the program that examines what the church teaches and why. Faith with Reasons.
Well, welcome aboard. Thank you for joining us for Faith with Reasons. I'm Ron Finn, along with Shayne Stanfield. Show number 540 here, as we really kind of enjoy the brunt of summer here.
It seems like 500 was just yesterday, so these are really counting up.
I know. Yeah, it's definitely summer. It's sweltering. I was lying this morning when I said it's going to rain after 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
And it really poured.
I was counting on that broadcast.
Well, what are you going to do? We're only good as the information that we receive, right?
I think we can find other words than sweltering. There's got to be something else out there to describe the soup.
Well, I've got a thesaurus around here somewhere. We'll check it out. Anyhow, great to have you along, and we are really excited about our new Pope. The first American Pope, Pope Leo the 14th, and we've been hearing a lot. We've been talking a lot with our, just from a financial standpoint, with Drew Blasek on our morning show about Pope Leo the 13th and his encyclical, Rerum Novarum, and learning a lot about that. And then here we find we have another Leo.
Yeah.
So this is pretty cool.
They're very cool.
And I love what he's done so far, too. He's just hit the ground running. But boy, oh boy, do we have an expert on the line with us today. You're very familiar, I'm sure, with Dr. Matthew Bunson. He is Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News. Now, for the past 30 years, Dr. Bunson's been active in the area of Catholic social communications and education, including writing, editing, and teaching on a variety of topics related to church history, the papacy, the saints, and Catholic culture. Now, he is the author or co-author of over 50 books, and those include St. Pope Paul VI, the Encyclopedia of Catholic History. That's a thick book. The Pope Encyclopedia. We Have a Pope, Benedict XVI, the Saints Encyclopedia, and various best-selling biographies, as well as the first English-language biography of Pope Francis. So no stranger to covering popes.
Yeah.
Dr. Matthew Bunson has written a brand new book. It just came out. Actually, it came out like instantly as soon as we had a new pope. Leo the 14th, Portrait of the First American Pope, which is available from EWTN Publishing and their publishing arm, Sophia Institute Press. Dr. Matthew Bunson, welcome to Faith with Reasons. Thank you for joining us here on Annunciation Radio.
Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be with you, genuinely. And it is a fascinating topic, both Leo the 14th and Leo the 13th.
Yes, and Leo the Great. I mean, there's so many great Leos out there.
a lot of wonderful Leos.
Absolutely. We've been hearing you on various programs, so I know you're a busy guy. And first and foremost, I've got to congratulate you on the book because it's a very easy read. It's a good read, and you learn a lot about this guy. Bob Prevost, that you hear about. We've seen pictures of his brother and comments from him and so forth. And of course, the event at the White Sox Stadium was incredible.
Yes.
So just to be a part of that and to be covering that right from the beginning. And this is the very first book out on our new Pope. I'm sure a lot of folks will be. They're trying to finish them up now, probably. But you researched them obviously ahead of time. Because you were pretty much ready to go right away. Did you start studying him like before the conclave even?
Well, the best way to answer that is that heading into the conclave, we understood that there was obviously a list of the so-called papabili. Those would be cardinals who are very prominent, who could very well have been elected pope. One of the names that landed on my radar a while back was Cardinal Prevost. In part because he obviously is an American, but he's also very prominent. And the thing about him was that in his role as the prefect for the Dicastery of Bishops, he kept a pretty low profile, but he was extremely well known and deeply respected. So heading into all the discussions about the papabili, I wouldn't say that he was top of the list, but he was certainly somebody who's very prominent. And when I talk to various people in Rome, various Vaticanisti, about the list of papabili, one of the questions that I would ask them, what about Cardinal Prevost? And they uniformly said, Well, he is certainly somebody who would be at the top of the list of the papabili were he not an American. Because everyone said the conventional wisdom was there's no possible way an American could be elected pope. So I kept asking that question as the days approached the conclave. And so I can honestly say, I have witnesses, that in the 3 days before the conclave started, I had his biography and a variety of other things about him on my phone and on my laptops, because I think he was somebody of intense interest. And even if he hadn't been elected, which thank heavens he was, I think he still would have been a very important figure in whatever the new pontificate was going to be.
Absolutely, and that's a great insight. That's a good instinct, and obviously your previous writings about various popes kind of gave you a little bit of an inside edge, I would think. Now, Pope Francis, of course, he passed away on April 21st, and obviously you've got the 9 days after and the public viewing and so forth, so there's a set pattern that goes into that when a pope passes, and we obviously don't really get to experience that very often because we have popes for so long. But during that time, with his health, further declining and him finally passing on, and the period of mourning after and so forth, and then entering into that, getting ready, assembling these cardinals from all over the world. I would imagine that had been quite a time. Were you in Rome during that time at all?
I was. I was on a plane basically on Monday the 21st, the afternoon of Pope Francis's passing.
Wow.
And landed in Rome on Tuesday that morning. And I was there for another basically 5 weeks. So I was there for the entire interregnum and then into the election, and then had the privilege of being able to stay over a number of days, especially to do the book launch, but really to work on the book following the conclusion of the conclave and the election of Pope Leo XIV. And then I was blessed truly to be able to do a book launch in Rome on May 22nd in the Vatican. So that's something that doesn't happen very often.
Wow.
In anybody's lifetime, let's put it that way.
Absolutely. Wow.
As I said, at least without being escorted out of the Vatican City by the Swiss Guard.
Well, and of course the chair of Peter was empty for a period of days, and I don't know about you, but I think we were all surprised that it only took 4 votes. I know in modernity, we've seen, 3, 4 votes, 5 votes, but we've gone as long as 3 years, in the voting process. So we didn't really know what to expect. Were you surprised that the vote came so quickly?
I can say that there was this obvious assumption that this would be a longer conclave for a couple of different reasons. The one, the cardinals themselves did not really know each other very well. And because they had not really been brought to Rome since 2014, really in 2022 they were all gathered, but they spent most of their time receiving a series of lectures on the reform of the Roman Curia and then also synodality. So because they didn't know each other, we assumed that it would take a little bit of time for them to settle on candidates, and that was the other reason that we assumed it might take a little longer. Just because there was one heavy favorite, and that's Cardinal Pietro Parolin, but then there was a very lengthy, but long list of other people who would be interesting to look at from the standpoint of papal candidates. And so when we looked at all of that together, it just made it probably a safe assumption. There's going to be maybe 3 days, 4 days. The longest in the last 100 and some years was in 1922, and that was 5 days, and that produced Pope Pius XI. But to see the turnaround as swiftly as we did, I think was pretty remarkable. It was essentially 4 ballots, and that is a testament because it took only 4 ballots, for example, for the election of Joseph Ratzinger as Pope Benedict XVI.
So I was really surprised to read, and I may have heard this previously, but the idea that Francis had elected 108 of those cardinals that were actually going to be electing our new pope out of the 133, And I think that that kind of fortifies what you said, that, you've got a bunch of folks that really don't know one another because they're essentially new.
Well, that's absolutely right. And there was always this working assumption, too, that incorrect. I had long disagreed with that, that somehow the cardinals were going to be very progressive.
Yeah.
That they would, and that simply wasn't the case.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too. I mean, the cardinals don't gather together like that very often. It did happen a couple of times during Francis's pontificate, but they didn't really have time, when, as you point out in your book, to really get to know each other during those brief times. They had such a tight agenda and so forth. So, yeah, for them to all gather there, and it did take some time to bring all of them there that were able to travel, a scant amount of time to really sit down with each other and just commiserate and get to know each other a little bit, let alone start to find common ground on different candidates.
Yeah, well, that's one of the questions that had emerged among the cardinals themselves, and that was how to remedy the obvious problem that they had, that they didn't know each other, and that there were a lot of issues to discuss at the end of Pope Francis's pontificate. And really, the answer that they gave was to give themselves a little bit more time in what are called the general congregation. In other words, to spend a lot more time deliberating with each other and really deciding what the church needed, and more importantly, who the church needed. And that's why, while they had the option of being able to set the date themselves as to when the conclave could start, what they ended up doing was giving themselves an extra couple of days before they actually began. So that gave them 2 full days of further discussions, and I think that proved crucial. So one of the things that they did, essentially, was to front-load so many of the discussions in order to shorten the back end of when they actually voted.
Wow. So going into this, they had a list. From what I remember, you wrote, it was maybe one of the last chapters of the book. They had a list of, they were provided a list of things that they needed to focus on as far as the concerns, the major concerns in the church to date. What did they know of this in advance, or is this something they were presented at the conclave? Because it seems like you haven't given a lot of thought over what seven bullet points, and yet not knowing these various cardinals. I mean, it just seems like an extraordinary amount of decision making in a relatively short period of time.
Well, that's exactly right. And one of the things about a general congregation is that they were encouraged to speak their minds. And that they clearly did. And you notice that when we have this discussion, you mentioned 7 bullet points. Those are some of the key things that are facing the church, things like war and peace, obviously, the divisions within the church, a question of law in the church, missionary zeal, synodality. They were very blunt with each other from everything that we've heard. And so they really wanted to, A, be heard, but then also to have an opportunity to listen to each other and to get to know each other, and then to look at the individual qualities and qualifications of each other. And, of course, each cardinal got up and spoke. They had something to say. Some were a little more controversial than others. I think, for example, of the intervention of one cardinal by the name of Benjamin Estella, who was a Francis appointee, who complained, actually, very publicly, in the middle of the general congregations, about some of the questions of law under the Francis pontificate. And that doesn't mean that this was a betrayal of Francis. I think it was a frank discussion about some of the ramifications of the pontificate and some of the things that were left undone or perhaps unsettled. And in that mix, in those discussions, from what we've heard and certainly what a few of the cardinals have said, they began noticing more and more certain names, certain individuals, and one of those happened to be Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost. And it was less what he said. There was in 2013, Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio gave this 4.5-minute presentation that absolutely sealed the deal with all of the cardinals. And in this case, it was far less explosive or far less rhetorical. It was rather the quiet presence of Cardinal Prevost, and how all of them noticed that he listened. He was so remarkably attentive when he was taking part in the discussions. It was noted, for example, that he every day was there. He was taking copious notes. All of that sort of added up into formalizing and confirming many of the things that they'd heard about him, that he was a great listener, that he was somebody who could build bridges among different factions and groups. So all of that came together, and it's very clear that by the time they entered the Sistine Chapel, they, in many cases, at least a large group of them, had found their candidate, and that's what propelled them to the papacy.
Yeah, I would think, given the fact that they've got kind of the bullet points or the main points that they're looking at, how many are going to fit all 7 of those, right? And he's obviously uniquely qualified across these. Matthew Bunson is our guest here on Faith with Reasons here on Annunciation Radio, and the book is wonderful. It's Leo XIV, Portrait of the First American Pope, from Sophia Institute Press, EWTN Publishing. You can go to EWTNRC.com and check this out. It definitely one to have. Obviously, now I've got like the Kindle version, but I want to get one that I can put on the bookshelf too, because it's just a beautiful book to have. And as you capture, Robert Prevost in its entirety, I mean, you take us through obviously his days growing up in Chicago. And again, an American pope? What? I don't think anybody saw that coming, but once you see, what he brings to the table, he, again, very uniquely qualified, and he brought his missionary spirit to all of his assignments, and, of course, his wonderful knowledge of canon law and everything else. But to start us off, just a look at his upbringing in Chicago itself was telling, because, I mean, this guy was destined to be a priest from a very young age.
Yes, he was. And that's one of the really striking things about his biography, that he grew up, obviously, in Chicago. Everyone knows that. He grew up just outside of Chicago in Dalton, Illinois. But the thing that really became so interesting to me as I was doing the research and starting to grapple with him and his background was how seemingly ordinary his upbringing was. That he grew up in what we can describe or call an average middle-class Catholic family in the 1950s and into the 1960s. And yet, this is deceptively ordinary, because this obviously then was a family that raised 3 sons deeply in the faith, a family that shared the faith with them. They all lived the faith together in an extraordinary way. And he grew up in a kind of Catholic ethos that helped foster this vocation to the priesthood. And not just the priesthood, but also to the religious life. But it was also one in which he was encouraged, that was nurtured by his family. So an immense amount of credit has to go to his parents and to his family and to the Catholic circle he grew up in. That we know that, for example, so many young men are called to the priesthood, but when we look at the various statistics, so many of them are never asked about the priesthood, or they're never encouraged in possibly discerning their vocation. Here he was encouraged, and both his mother and his father were there every step of the way for him, and I think that was decisive in his formation, and I think it really led him into that level of confidence that this was the right decision on his part, and he never looked back, and I think that really, we can't underestimate that.
And of course, you've written about, how he and his brothers, they were very active, but while his brothers were playing in sports and the typical things that kids do in the neighborhood, here he is he's playing priest with the little wafers and the ironing board or something. It's just amazing. And of course, you also included the fact that even family could see that he was destined for the priesthood just by his very action. I mean, there's very few kids that are actually doing such a thing. It's less common, obviously, today than it may have been back then, but it was very telling in his behavior.
Yeah, it was, and he had, shall we say, his brothers as his congregation, which I think is pretty fun because there was probably a fairly unruly congregation, given that the fun I know that we know he had with his brothers and his family. But it was very clear that he was called to be a priest, and people around him saw it. And in fact, one of the neighbors at one point, or one of the teachers, made the joke that, well, you're going to become the first American pope.
Yeah.
Not realizing, of course, the remarkable significance of what was just said and how it actually did pan out like that.
Yeah, yeah. And then there was an interesting point that you brought up that I think would be a tidbit our audience may not know, but you made this connection between, of course, he was a mathematics major, and yet the man that invented it was some form of an early calculator, made his riches off of this invention. This mansion that he built was given over to a school that he ended up attending for studies advancing towards his priesthood.
That's right. Yeah, and I think there was a fascinating confluence of events. We would call that providence, of course, and that is that he was discerning this vocation. They were going to send him to another Augustinian school. He did his junior seminary, sort of his high school, in an Augustinian institution in Michigan. And then they were going to send him to another house of formation, which closed. So instead, he ended up in Villanova University. What's interesting is that he took as his major mathematics, as you just noted, but he also, which is unusual for the time, studied Latin and Greek, and clearly had something else in mind. But it speaks to the orderliness of his mind, of his interest in precision, that he was so interested in taking mathematics. And we can see a similar bent in his pursuit of a doctorate in canon law. Both of those fields require great precision, great discipline of the mind. And that was certainly the case with Robert Prevost, and we have seen how that precision has played out in so many different ways throughout his ministerial life, and as he's assumed an escalating number of roles of leadership in the church. But at the same time, he was somebody who enjoyed life. He was very much just a very well-rounded individual. We can see that from his time at Villanova, when, for example, he would play guitar. He loved to sing. He was very active on campus. He took part in the pro-life rallies in the early 1970s as abortion was launched. The horror of abortion was launched across the United States, and that commitment to the pro-life cause is something that has stayed with him ever since. I mean, we know that he's ardently pro-life, just if nothing else from his social media accounts. So this was somebody who, we always have these images of popes as being people who dedicated their lives to prayer, and that's all they did forever, so to speak, sort of a cliche that we have. And yet this is somebody who really was fun, who I would never say he was a guy, but he was certainly somebody who had a way of enjoying sports. He liked to drive long distances. So there was about him a very well-formed and well-balanced personality.
I know our own Bishop Daniel Thomas, the Bishop of the Diocese of Toledo, was working at the Vatican for about 12 to 15 years. During the time that Father Prevost was there running the Augustinian order, and I think their offices were just down the hall from each other. Although they didn't really know each other, they certainly crossed paths over time. But one of our bishop's first reactions was he was very grateful that we have a pope who sings.
That's exactly right. And boy, does he know how to sing. That's when he came out and chanted the Regina Caeli during his first Regina Caeli as Pope. I remember commenting, I don't think I said it on the air, but when he walked out onto the central loggia, we're used to the Angelus and the Regina Caeli from the window of the Apostolic Palace, but he walked out again just a few days after he had been elected walked out again onto the central loggia. I said that as he stood there, he seemed almost like a pope from a different century because of the serenity about him. And then, what does he do? He, as you say, he sings the Regina Caeli, and he sings it really well. You know, John Paul II always had a great voice, but I cannot remember, and I haven't been able to find any evidence that he was actually somebody who sang the Regina Caeli. So this is the next thing that we can say is somewhat unprecedented about Pope Leo. Yeah.
Now, you just to go back briefly. I know we're about ready to head to break, but you mentioned obviously he's educated in mathematics, of course. But then it was, if I remember correctly, you wrote about it was his order that directed him to go study canon law. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, and by that point too, that would have been the way it would go for him in terms of how they would like to see him formed. Mm-hmm. You know, so he has an undergrad degree in mathematics and all these other minors from Villanova, and then he earned an MDiv, a Master of Divinity degree from the Catholic Theological Union in the Chicago area, and then they sent him to Rome for additional training. That tells you that the order itself had already recognized that they had something very unusual, something remarkable in this young Augustinian. Ordained in 1982, and then finishes his licentiate in 1985, around the same time that they sent him to Peru, and then was able to finish his dissertation, and I'll come back to that in a minute, in 1987. So it takes a while to get some of these done because he was very active by that point. But it tells you that they had plans for him, that this is somebody that they recognized with real talent. And he studied in Rome at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelicum, which is run by the Dominicans, and of course is one of the greatest of the pontifical universities in the church today.
Very good. And of course, again, we're headed up to break, and we can continue this on the other side. But I'd like to get a little bit more of those very beginning years of him completing his degree and beginning his mission work in Peru, because I know there's a lot of ground to cover there. And I'd also like to get into some of the turmoil that was going on in Peru at that time as well, because there were a lot of struggles that he was facing. So again, we can pick this up on the other side.
Dr. Matthew Bunson is our guest here on Faith with Reasons. We're talking about his book, Leo XIV, Portrait of the First American Pope, from EWTN Publishing, Sophia Institute Press. We will take a little bit of a break. Can't wait to get back and delve more into this wonderful book. Please stay tuned. People are talking about Annunciation Radio.
I listen because of all the things I've learned about how to defend and spread the faith.
Annunciation Radio, faith with frequency. Your St. Vincent de Paul Toledo thrift store has moved. Our new location is 5311 Airport Highway in the Airport Square Shopping Center, right next to Pet Supplies Plus at Airport and Reynolds. Come check out our new store. Open from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Saturday, accepting donations from 10 to 4. Come see the new location of the St. Vincent de Paul Toledo Thrift Store, Airport Highway at Reynolds Road.
A portion of our programming today is brought to you by Carpets by Otto. Family-owned Carpets by Otto, delivering better living with better floors since 1969. Their landmark showroom is located at the corner of Angola and Reynolds Road in Toledo. Carpets by Otto provides in-home consultations and free estimates. More information at 419-381-7206 or at carpetsbyotto.com.
Catholics acknowledge that the deposit or rule of faith is sacred scripture and apostolic tradition as manifested in the living teaching authority of the Catholic Church. In rejecting the papacy and teaching authority of the Catholic Church, the Protestant reformers thought they found the rule of faith in the Bible. Individual, private interpretation guided by the Holy Spirit. Yet the Bible denies that it is sufficient as the Church's rule of faith. Paul acknowledges that much Christian teaching is to be found in the tradition that is handed down by word of mouth in 1 Corinthians 11:2 and 2 Timothy 2, verse 2. He instructs us in 2 Thessalonians 2:15 to stand firm and hold to the traditions which you were taught by us, either by word of mouth or by letter. Examining the truths of the Catholic faith. This is faithforensics.org.
Now, back to Faith with Reasons here on Annunciation Radio.
Hey, welcome back here. Shayne, Stanfield, Ron Finn, and today we're blessed to have Dr. Matthew Bunson with us, Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News. For the past 30 years, Dr. Bunson has been active in the area of Catholic social communications and education, including writing, editing, and teaching on a variety of topics related to church history, the papacy, the saints, and Catholic culture. He is the author or co-author of over 50 books, including St. Pope Paul VI, the Encyclopedia of Catholic History, the Pope Encyclopedia. We have a Pope, Benedict XVI, the Saints Encyclopedia, and various best-selling biographies, as well as the first English language biography of Pope Francis. And today we're discussing his latest work, Pope Leo XIV, Portrait of the First American Pope, which amazingly is out with only just a few weeks after the election of our latest Pope, and we're into the thick of things, discussing Pope Leo. The last half hour, basically finishing up his degree and landing in Peru for his first round of mission work, and I think we can pick it up there. And again, as I said in the last half hour, I'm kind of interested to discuss this time that he was serving in Peru, because of course it was a time of great political turmoil taking place there, and there's and you've written about how he was able to work in and around that, and quite successfully. So, Doctor, I think we can pick it up from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that is interesting about his choice for his thesis for his doctorate in canon law was it focused on the rights, responsibilities, and authority of the local prior in an Augustinian community. Now, doctrines in canon law tend to be very, very specific, like this one is. I've had a chance to actually take a good look at this dissertation, and one of the things that really jumps out is how he is less focused, I think, on sort of the powers and authority, as much as it is the way that a local prior, the local head of an Augustinian community, should be a servant, somebody who truly cares about those who are in his charge. And you could see an echo of that on May 18th when he celebrated his installation mass in St. Peter's Square. And he used the interesting phrase that a pope should not be an autocrat, but should be a servant. And he clearly sees himself in that way. And I think that's an attitude that has certainly been very clearly a hallmark of his time of service in the church over these long decades. But it also, I think, served him extremely well in two ways. The first is, he was ordained in 1982, as I was saying. They send him to Peru only 3 years later. And this is one of the toughest missionary territories that you'll ever encounter. The rugged mountains of Peru are not for the faint of heart, and he was sent out into incredibly rugged terrain. It required donkeys, it required horses, you would have to travel on foot. If you could drive, it would be a precarious one along very dangerous mountain roads. And he not only was sent there and undertook his mission, but he absolutely thrived. He displayed one of the key attributes of a great missionary. Think of someone like St. Francis Xavier. He arrived and began acclimating. He began enculturating. He began really taking in where he was being asked to serve. That meant mastering Spanish. And of course, he reached beyond fluency in Spanish. But it also meant that he embraced the culture, the nuance of it, and understood it as key to being able to preach effectively. But above all, He was a servant to the people to whom he was proclaiming the gospel, and he became, in a very short amount of time, a genuinely beloved figure in the missions there.
And that's fascinating. Now, it was a period of how long before he was made bishop of this area in Chile?
Yeah, well, he had a remarkable career in that sense, because he was sent back briefly from Peru. He finished his doctorate, then went back to Peru and served for quite a number of years there in the missionary field. And then, after a brief stint back in the United States, he was elected the head of all of the Augustinians, in other words, the Order of St. Augustine. Mm. And that, of course, means that he ran the entire order, which also required him to do two things. One, he would be based in Rome. So he was back in Rome and appreciating, I think, the culture of the Vatican, of the Roman Curia. The headquarters are essentially across the street from the Vatican itself. Mm-hmm. But it also meant that he had to travel intensely. And he did this for 12 years. Mm-hmm. He was twice elected the head of the Augustinians. That required, as I was saying, travel, solving problems that the whole order would be facing in all the far-flung corners of the world. Those are institutions, those are communities, those are finding and mentoring the future leadership of the Augustinians. Then when he came back, he served briefly in the United States, and then was chosen by Pope Francis to go back to Peru. And that was in 2014, to serve as the apostolic administrator of a diocese called Chiclayo in Peru. And it was facing various challenges. And the very next year, Pope Francis elevated him to become Bishop of Chiclayo, and he was there essentially until 2023, when Pope Francis officially moved him back to Rome to become prefect for the dicastery for bishops, which, of course, is one of the most important offices in the whole of the church.
So during the period of time, mainly at the time that he was a priest, not as a bishop, but he's serving his community. And by the way, every time, and it's just a personal thing, as a little side thing, I have to say, every time I see Chiclayo in your book, I want to see Chicago. Mm-hmm. but that's just yes. Me. But anyhow, I during this time, there was a tremendous political turmoil, which he obviously had to navigate. I mean, you had governments being overthrown. You had this what you refer to as like a more or less a Marxist revolution that was taking place, and then you've got a hardliner that's coming in that's saying we've got to get rid of these Marxists, and he ended up being a dictator.
That's right. What you're talking about is the Shining Path.
Yeah.
And the Shining Path was a terrible Maoist revolutionary group that had as its goal not just the overthrow of the whole of the Peruvian government, but then the installation of Marxist regimes across the whole of Latin America and beyond. Mm-hmm. And their methods included assassination and kidnapping and torture and threats to anyone who stood in their way. One of the realities was, too, that the Peruvian government, under then its premier, Alberto Fujimori, responded to the Shining Path with very, very stern measures that many considered to be very excessive. Bishop Prevost, Father Prevost, Bishop Prevost, was caught up in both of those campaigns, and he spoke out against the violence of both of those campaigns. Mm-hmm. This is, to give some context, about 70,000 people died.
Wow.
Yeah.
And in the violence. And ultimately, Fujimori himself fell from power and was arrested and put on trial for crimes, war crimes, and other offenses. And Bishop Prevost stood down the Shining Path. He as a missionary there, he defended the young priests who were under threat. He stared down gunmen from the Shining Path who were trying to kidnap some of the seminarians. So he was very much aware of the threats that the Shining Path was posing, but also that the excesses of the government were posing as well. And I think that was kind of a hallmark of the fact that he didn't choose sides, because he realized you can't under those circumstances. But
Right.
that realistically then put him in opposition to both of the camps at a time when they were very much determined to murder each other.
And he could have very much been eliminated himself. I mean, that's notoriously what the communists or the Marxists do. They're enemies of the church. So if you stand up in opposition, I mean, you're really putting your life on the line.
That's very true, and I think it gave him a perspective that was important to have, especially as bishop in Chiclayo, recognizing the violence that has unfortunately been endemic in parts of Latin America. But it also elevated his profile in so many different ways in Peru and beyond. As bishop in Chiclayo, he was very much respected as a pastor, as a shepherd, but he was then also elected as vice president of the Peruvian Bishops' Conference, so that elevated his profile even more.
Mm-hmm.
Remarkable because he was not from Peru. I mean, he was a missionary bishop. He became a naturalized Peruvian citizen. And the thing that also really stays with me is that, yes, he was a naturalized Peruvian citizen, but he really fell in love with Peru.
Yeah,
It's obvious in the way he speaks about it, but it's also obvious in the way that the Peruvians speak about it. I've said that as Americans, we have an understandable pride in the fact that he is the first U.S.-born pope.
Mm-hmm.
But the Peruvians have the same pride that they have him as what they consider to be the first Peruvian pope. And I mean that when I say it. He's called a Peruano. In other words, he's somebody who is essentially Peruvian. And if we want a demonstration of how much he loves Peru, let's go back to the day he was elected, and he was on the loggia of St. Peter's. And he gave a shout-out to Peru, and in particular, his old diocese in Chiclayo, in Espanol. So he spoke 3 languages that day: Latin, Italian, and Spanish. Notably, he did not speak English.
Wow. Yeah. Now, just to highlight how much he was loved. I mean, it's you write about, as a bishop, he was entitled to chauffeur service, and he refused this. He was known to just drive around on his own, but intentionally, to be very, very close to his people. But when the road ended, you also wrote that he was jumping on horses and riding horseback through the countryside as well as a bishop. So,
as a bishop, yes, that's right.
Yeah,
and one thing too, and it's a bit of an indicator too of his personality and his preferences that may shape some of the things he does as Pope, is that even in the midst of the missions of Peru, he expected liturgical precision. He wanted liturgies to be done properly. And that, to me, is very interesting, because we can see how that is translated already into many of his so-called sartorial choices since the time of his election. That he is very precise in his liturgical vesture. He believes in continuity in all of his liturgical celebrations. It's why, for example, he's worn vestments from John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and some that were worn by Pope Francis, and why he's chosen as well some of the pastoral staffs. All of those tell us that much as he is a mathematician, much as he is a canon lawyer, yes, he's also very much somebody concerned with continuity and good liturgy in practice, even in the fields of Peru.
And as Pope Francis said, to smell like the sheep, right? This is a man who really smells like the sheep, because he did, I mean, even during, as you mentioned in your book, during COVID, Peru was one of the most tightened down, clamped down areas anywhere in the world. And yet he still was able to visit his people, to accompany them, and to bring them the sacraments.
That's right. And he was determined to do so. And again, that is one of the reasons why I think he was as beloved as he was and respected as he was. Now it's going to be interesting to see how that translates into this same missionary zeal for the universal church. It is interesting when we're pondering what the cardinals were looking for. One of those categories was finding someone with real missionary zeal. And well, they certainly realized that they had somebody who had been in the missions for as long as he had, but who was also so respected in the missions, but who was also very clear in what he taught in the missions. And there's always this worry that in the efforts at enculturation and other things, that we begin to water down what we're teaching. And I think one thing that we have seen consistently, at least in these weeks and weeks after his election, is that Pope Leo XIV is very clear in what he writes and what he says. He doesn't leave a lot unsaid when it comes to key matters of doctrine. And he's very clear in saying things that he doesn't necessarily have to, but he does so for clarity. I think the best example would be several times now, including to the journalists around the world, but also to the diplomats who are accredited to the Holy See, and then in a few other locations and events. He talks about marriage and family, but he doesn't leave family as some vague, idealized notion. He's very clear that when he says a union of a man and a woman, and so he's very precise in that, so there can be no ambiguity by what he means, and certainly what the church means by family.
Just in case, because there's a lot of secular out there that will run that, and they will label this marriage, and they will include these same-sex unions that believe, in fact, that they are marriage when they're not.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hallmark of his time as bishop too, that he was very clear. Famously, he gave right after he was appointed to Rome as the new prefect for the dicastery for bishops. He went back to Peru and gave a commencement speech, and it stirred a little bit of, not controversy, but it was notable that this speech was highlighted after his election as Leo XIV. He talked about Cardinal Bernardin, very famously with the so-called seamless garment. And he talked about how that was something that is an interesting image to have, where when we're talking about Catholic social teaching, that it touches on all aspects of what the church believes. But then, at the risk, as is always the case when talking about something like the seamless garment, he dismissed and demolished any notion that there is somehow an equivalence among all of those different elements of Catholic social teaching. In other words, abortion, euthanasia are preeminent, that they are intrinsic evils of a different weight than other aspects of Catholic social teaching, and many of which fall under prudential judgment. He says that in his presentation, so there can be no misconstruing what he's getting at in terms of applying Catholic social teaching, but at no time is he suggesting that we should dismiss or water down what the church truly believes. And I think that so far has been one of the hallmarks, and I think that was one of the reasons, too, why the cardinals, as they got to know him, appreciated him.
Boy, and he certainly spoke eloquently at the conclave to fellow cardinals as well. Just to remind our listeners, we're talking about the book Leo XIV, Portrait of the First American Pope. Dr. Matthew Bunson is joining us here on Faith with Reasons. Pope Leo XIV, all we've heard so far, I mean, everything seems to fall to certain themes of his that are really the foundation of who this man is. I mean, even today, on the Wednesday audience, he's, taking a turn in the Pope Mobile, he's greeting people, and he continues his catechesis on Jesus Christ, our hope. He's always drawing people deeper into the church, and really doing so in a very humble way, and really pointing people to Jesus Christ and the church.
Absolutely crucial to understanding, I think, certainly where he wants to take the church, and I think also what he wants to make as the central pillar. We can say that all popes will talk about our Lord, Jesus Christ, so that's not something unusual for a pope to do. But Pope Leo XIV, you can see from the very motto that he took as bishop all the way back in 2014, and that was in Illo Uno Uno. In Christ we are one. It's a reflection, very Augustinian, of course. This is from Augustine's commentary on Psalm 127, saying that in Christ we are one. But if we focus on two aspects of that, the very first words out of his mouth on the day of his election, peace be with you. So he proclaims Jesus Christ. He proclaims that peace is only possible. How? Through the risen Christ. Having that encounter with the risen Christ. And his choice of motto, his very first words, he's making it very clear that he wants to be a proclaimer and somebody who brings peace. But it's authentic peace. It is, again, the peace that only Christ can bring, can give, which is itself very Augustinian. So he's going to be a promoter of peace around the world, but then he's also very clearly wanting to bring peace to what I think we can safely say in many quarters of the church right now, there is division. There is a certain disunity on various matters. And I think Pope Leo wants to try to bring everyone together, but it isn't going to be this false amity, this false peace. It has to be an authentic peace, and you can only have that when it's rooted in Christ.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I guess it's been on my mind, and we can only speculate at this point, but maybe you have an opinion based on things that you've seen. Obviously, we've already talked about he seems to be going out of his way to be very clear. So we're not making comments that can be misconstrued in any way, which that's very different from the last papacy, of course. But is there any indication that some of the things that were pushed out during the last with under Pope Francis, let's say, the push to remove the Latin Mass, and to do these things that seem to create great division, which, I mean, there's a lot of concern that there wasn't anything that anybody could see was very divisive, but yet it seemed to create more stir than what it seemingly was worth. Do you think that there's a reversal of this? Do you see it personally, or is there any writing on the wall that you can see based on anything he's done that in other words, to try to unify the church once again, where we've seen quite a bit of disunity recently?
Yeah, that's a very fair question to ask. He has made it obvious, as we've just been talking, that unity in the church is centrally important to him. Now, he has before him then several major issues that we have to face as a church and now as Pope that he will be tackling head on. The first is synodality, how he will steer Pope Francis's grand project for the church into the future. He has in 2028, for example, this gathering of the synod. And what that looks like, I think, will give us a very clear idea of Pope Leo's priorities, at least regard to the project of synodality in the life of the church. He has said some things that it makes it clear that he sees synodality, obviously, and not in terms of rejecting Pope Francis, but he's also contextualizing it in different ways that I think are going to be very interesting in the years to come. He also has to deal with the German synodal way, which is this heterodox enterprise, unraveling church teaching on a variety of fronts, including things like the ordination of women, priestly celibacy, the church's very clear teachings on human sexuality and authority in the life of the church. How he deals with that is also going to be a big indicator. And then, as you say, rightly so, the question of the traditional Latin Mass, he has a variety of options in front of him. He can continue to push for or decree the very severe set of limitations on it, or he could steer it in a different direction. For example, one of his options would be to leave it in many ways where it is right now, with the individual bishops in the church. Now, we have seen in the last week some controversy surrounding all of that in different places. I think, for example, the Diocese of Charlotte. So how he handles that, I think, is going to be a big indicator of how he wants to go about restoring peace on multiple fronts in the life of the church. And right now, it's difficult to predict exactly what he's going to do, but I think he will try to do it in a way that is consistent with his leadership style, which is to listen to a lot of people. And he'll be consulting experts. We know that I've talked with people who are very familiar with the goings-on in the Vatican, for example. That's something he's already been doing on other fronts, for example, liturgy and things. So I think he will listen and he will weigh prudently what the best course of action is, and then he will execute on it. So I think that's something that he'll be very deliberative about, but he's also not indecisive. So when the decision comes, it will be very clear. And he's somebody who, once he makes a decision, because he has gone through all of these necessary steps of listening and consulting, that it will be a firm one. So all we can do is just wait and see what he chooses to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're definitely excited about not just the fact that he's the first American pope, but there's going to be some clarity that we've already seen with him. When he speaks, we know what he's saying. There's no ambiguity at all. And I think, correct me, if you think differently, but it just seems like, he's the right pope for the right time. He's already talking, and dealing with AI, for example. And, of course, a lot of the big issues in Leo XIII's time, he was right there at the right time for his pontificate. This seems like a parallel to me.
Very much so, and I think it's one of the reasons why he chose the name Leo XIV in honor, to a large degree, of Leo XIII, who grappled in his time with the great revolutions, so the Industrial Revolution, that was shaping and influencing everything in the world and the lives of Catholics everywhere, especially those who are workers. So Leo XIII was so taken up with these concerns about the impact on family life and the dignity of the human person. And Leo himself has said very clearly that he is concerned in much the same way with the great revolutions that we're seeing today in technology. It's why he talks about AI, for example. And he brings it down to its essence, defending the human person. I think that's something that we're going to see as another hallmark of this pontificate.
That's wonderful. And at 69, we're going to have him around for a while. That'll be great.
Yeah.
Yes, we will. Plus, he's a tennis player and used to go to the gym. So I think he's in very good shape.
That's awesome.
Great. Dr. Matthew Bunson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And most especially, thank you so much for this great book, Leo XIV, Portrait of the First American Pope, EWTN Publishing. Check that out. And check us out next week, too. Faith with Reasons back next week with Father James Kubicki here on Faith with Reasons. Thanks for joining us.